How's it going?
Hi,
I'm Alex.
I'm Val.
We're going to talk about Sopranos,
Yeah, as usual.
as usual.
Today we're talking about Season 2, Episode 5, Big Girls Don't Cry.
Very exciting in
Yeah.
terms of the crew that comes on. First, Terrence Winter, writing credit, who then goes on to be one of the main writers for this show. And one of the main writers for HBO, kind of one of the
Totally.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So this one's also directed by Tim Van Patten, who we've been mentioning a bunch. But it's crazy with Terrence Winter because I was looking up the stuff that he did before The Sopranos, and it's actually kind of unremarkable in a way, considering what he went on to do after writing for this show. Because after this, obviously, he went on to kind of create Boardwalk Empire, and I mean do all sorts of stuff. I think he was actually on vinyl as well. Kind of brought on for that in the beginning, but he's
That show sucks.
Ooh, Val's opinions come out early today.
Well, anyways, today
That's
we just watched the episode.
Yeah,
We're gonna sit down and talk about it. I just realized there was one thing that I wanted to look up, but I guess it's too late.
Guess it's too late.
Yeah.
What was it?
Ozzie and Harriet.
Ozzie and Harriet. Well, let us know if you know what Ozzie and Harriet is, because we don't. Oh yeah, I was gonna look up more on Lou Costello too.
Yeah.
Oh well. Sorry guys.
Too late.
If our trivia was better, we could go do a more thorough analysis as this went on.
But we don't tend to do that anyways. So.
Yeah. So unfortunately, our ignorance is going to get the best of us on drawing incredibly profound Ozzie and Harriet and Lou Costello observations. So.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. I was kind of thinking, let's start by talking about the title.
Okay. Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's talk about it.
So, Big Girls Don't Cry.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Frankie Valli. And the Four Seasons? I don't know.
Oh, man. Our trivia is brutal today.
But we hear it playing in the background when Tony and Polly and...
Is that when Johnny Sack shows up?
No, the earlier in the episode when they're just at New Vesuvio's.
That's right. The first time. Well, Tony's there, and that's the time when Artie and Charmaine are talking about how they've not paid their tab a few times in a row.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
time, right.
Exactly. So we hear it playing in the background, but I think with a lot of our female characters and even some of our male characters, there's a lot that deals with kind of being strong in different moments and then also being vulnerable or emotional in other moments. And so I feel like there's a couple instances for sure. The couple that kind of stand out to me are the wife / girlfriend of Dominic, the whatever it was, whorehouse owner. She's kind of, and it's reflected back by comments from a few characters. She's actually the one that's kind of standing up to at least Christopher more so than Dominic is, right?
Yeah.
She's the one who's you're not providing us with any security, da-da-da-da. And then later we hear, Tony says to Furio, what did I tell you? And he's the wife is also, is also an issue, not just Dominic, right? So then he acts in a certain way. We can talk more about that scene after, but... the other one, is with when we get a short. I love when we get Artie and Charmaine.
Yeah.
But we also see her kind of in this role where Artie's kind of a doofus a lot.
Yeah.
He just kind of, he, even though he tries to stand up to Tony about hiring Furio, he kind of, concedes. And then we see Furio in the kitchen making mozzarella.
Right.
Charmaine's the one who's they haven't paid their tab. This is the third time or whatever, 3 times this week. And Artie's kind of I can't turn down a 4-top or whatever he says.
Yeah.
So we see her. But then we see a character like Melfi, who is reflecting a lot on kind of these ideas of childishness or being a child, right? She talks about a time when she was a young girl watching Wizard of Oz. She refers to Tony as a little boy. So there's kind of something there. And it is, even just the statement, big girls don't cry, right? It kind of says, in order to be an adult or in order to, grow up. And there's a few times, actually, where characters are told to grow the fuck up or grow up. But there is this kind of differentiation between like what it means to be an adult and what it means to be a child, and one of them doesn't allow this kind of emotionality, or I don't know, like base kind of responses to things.
Yeah.
And we see Christopher, of course, like showing a lot of emotion, which makes him, it makes him reflect on what it meant to be a child and his father, right? It puts him into this position that he's not necessarily comfortable with.
Definitely.
Because he's kind of playing the other part, playing this adult guy.
Yeah.
We see Tony grappling with issues of, when he was a child, he finds out things about his own father, that he used to have these panic attacks, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there was another example. Well, I guess we also see, so in terms of, again, the title, we also see Tony thinking a lot about more about his kids than we see him think about them sometimes.
Yeah.
Like when he throws the phone.
That's an amazing scene.
AJ's kind of standing there being AJ, right? And, so Tony has this moment
she says, "Why don't you grow the fuck up?"
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he goes and he says, basically, him growing up is him going and talking to AJ and saying, "Got a job at Radio Shack, product tester, testing that phone for durability." Then he walks away.
Yeah, but
that's it.
But you could tell, like, his intention was to kind of like smooth it over with AJ. Like, he didn't want AJ to see him act that way, and he says that later on. Like, he wants to direct his anger towards the people that actually deserve it, right?
You also see how out of place he is, though, in terms of acting as an adult.
Sure.
And in terms of, him resolving that conflict or resolving that issue, he's just pretty incapable of it.
Yeah, but he's also concerned with, like, when he's on his boat with Irina, and he grabs that guy by the balls, and he's worried he's going to get in trouble. He's like, I don't want the kids to find out. He's like, Carm finding it, like, Carm knowing who I was on the boat with, that's usual or whatever. But the kids... So he's really concerned. We also have ducks in that scene, too. So, and then he talks about how he's like avoiding his pool. So for me, that was like...
And there has been a connection of the ducks to his family. That's how he analyzes it that's how it is analyzed in the first episode. But the fact that Irene is feeding them these cheesy poofs or whatever.
Which is like a childish food.
Yeah, and also, but it's also something toxic for the ducks, and that he kind of flips out over that. There's an element of...
He's like, you should be feeding them bread and corn.
Yeah. Again, he's pretty out of his element.
Yeah.
But he's clearly concerned about, like, this toxicity reaching his kids. Which is interesting because there's not many people that Tony's that concerned about the toxic element of his actions reaching.
No. But I saw it, like, more in this episode than I have in past. So there's definitely some level of connection there. Like what it means to be a child, what it means to grow up.
Yeah.
That was kind of my first about the title thing. Was there anything else that the title made you...
Well, it made me think a lot about Christopher and his actions. Because, I mean, he's somebody who we actually see kind of break down crying. And that's something that's very unusual for his character. And I think that this episode in particular really expands on Christopher as a character. And I feel like when he's acting... we see kind of an affinity for that craft and an aptitude for it that's kind of interesting. It's something that actually he does kind of connect with. And when he has that Rebel Without a Cause scene, he's kind of like injecting realism into the performance that's otherwise like kind of a joke almost. Like the other people are just like not really capable of having any realism in their performance.
When he does that slow fake zipper.
The slow fake zipper. What's the slow fake zipper?
Well, at the end, he's like doing up the coat. He says he was always cold, and he's like so carefully zipping up, like this like very realistic seeming zipper that's not really there.
That's right. Oh, I missed that.
Yeah, it's a good one.
But it's interesting. Like he has like that level of realism and attention to detail, and being able to draw on his own life. Like it actually makes the performance of the others in the class a lot better too. Like Mitch, who's like. So kind of wooden as he comes out at first. And then he's kind of confused because he doesn't know how to respond to that level of performance from Christopher. But then he actually gets a lot better. So it actually kind of like elevates everybody. But I feel like the key scene for Christopher's arc in this episode is when Adriana is saying things like, acting is mostly feelings. And she also talks about...
Unless you're driving having a sword fight.
unless you're driving a car or sword fighting. And for me, that's exactly right. She kind of hits the nail on the head, because that's what Christopher's looking for when he's trying to change his scene. He asks for a scene with no dialogue, jumping out of the car before it goes off a cliff.
Well, that's also Christopher's job. He drives Tony around he fights. That's his role in the movie.
Yeah, he's drawing from his life. He's not expanding. He's not being curious to get outside of that extremely kind of basic level. And he doesn't have to deal with his feelings.
No.
And he kind of just wants to continue that. The scary thing for him is that when he gets out of that world, he's actually kind of talented at it and there's something deeper there. But I think it also scares him.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, that's why when he actually reflects on it, his reaction is to take his screenplay, take all the writing, take the floppy disks and throw them out.
I like how in that scene where he throws out his scripts and his floppy disks, you think maybe at first he's just going to like start something new, right? Like he throws away he looks at his script, when I bark, you bite, or whatever. Or when you bark, I bite. And he throws those away. But then you see him go to his computer and you have this moment where you're like, that's it. He's going to start writing something real, like he's going to start, and he like, you I don't know, you have this moment of hope for Christopher. You have lots of moments of hope for Christopher as the series goes on. But then he takes out the floppy disk, chucks those away, and then he has this very dramatic scene of this slow pan down this dark hallway, right? Like the garbage hallway. And he's limping because he has this foot injury. The end credit music is coming into the coming into your earshot. The sound effect that comes with him throwing his stuff into the garbage is like a little bit over exaggerated. It's like a sound of breaking glass, which doesn't really make that much sense. but it is this like overly dramatic scene where he does have a lot of feeling, right?
Totally.
Like he's making, it's a character point for him, right? Like he's trying to put that part of him behind himself.
Well, and interestingly too, he actually throws everything into a white garbage bag and then throws it into the dumpster, all black garbage bags. And when I was watching, I said, I'm not going to say anything about color.
But then you did.
There were some really good ones in this one. In fact, I'm going to leave color alone, but the blacks and whites, there's really some things going on actually. And actually it's a quick shot, but you see that garbage bag full of that possible side of Christopher sitting in the dumpster, which is such like a literal image, but it is surrounded by these kind of like
darkness.
All black garbage bags.
No, I mean that's obviously on purpose. And that is this part of Christopher that's so endearing. I mean, lots of things about Christopher are so endearing because I love him. He's my favorite character, but you like see, like I said, like in that moment where you think he's going to start writing this great script, it is this kind of part of him that is good and hopeful, and we see it come back at times, but oh, Christopher.
Was there other things with Christopher that you wanted to talk about during his role in this episode?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Like I was trying to think about in the short time between us watching this and then talking about it. Sometimes it's hard to like solidify my thoughts or something like that. But I was trying to think about the glass menagerie bit and why that felt so, like, what was it about that was really like bothering him so much, or he really didn't feel like he could access that scene? Like maybe it's because that character is so far from him, like he can't get the emotionality of characters who are like too far away from him or something like that. Like he needs to be able to tap into something real for him. I'm not sure. I love that exchange between him and Adriana about the gentleman caller, right? Like she's like, maybe it's because he's a gentleman, and she's like, and he's like, he's a douchebag.
I think also another thing that's interesting is him going to take care of the Dominic situation in the beginning, and how underwhelming it is compared to Furios dealing with it. And
I mean,
it's interesting.
in the moment it's violent, and it's,
in the moment it does seem violent,
yeah.
but it's nothing compared to what Furio does.
Yeah.
And Tony realizes that, and you can see the kind of power structure of the family shifting right now. Mm-hmm. And he says, I want you to take care of it, and then to Christopher when they're at his house, but then he says, never mind, looking over at Furio. And it's interesting, actually, like, he looks at him and realizes that there's an opportunity here. But the way that James Gandolfini acts it is really interesting, because he looks at Furio, he has this realization and makes a decision. There's actually almost like a slight glimmer of like excitement or joy or something that comes to him in terms of him processing Furio doing it, knowing how violent he would be. And we've seen him in Italy where he like not only beats up the kid who throws the firecrackers, but actually like hits the kid's mom. Yeah. Which then comes into play during this scene where he's actually like hitting Dominic's wife, which is something,
and other girls,
and I mean just everybody. Yeah. Also, he's during that scene when Furio goes in all black during that violent scene. Just wanted to point out.
Yeah, but what about the outfit he's wearing at the party?
At the party, ooh, that's a great one. Yeah, a little bit more complicated. It's actually interesting too, seeing him at Nuevo Vesuvio, where he's wearing all white. Actually, I know that they're in the kitchen and that's what you wear if you're a chef or whatever. But I do think it's interesting because this show has established blacks and whites reflecting different aspects of where people fall as characters. And we've seen this before with Artie playing with blacks and whites in terms of what he's wearing. And that all white, I think there's something about it that's like as far away from the mob as possible. Even though like Furio like obviously isn't. But in that environment, there's something detached. Because, you don't really see mob characters like wearing all whites or something. There's some.
Even the mozzarella was white.
Wow. Thanks. But I think there is something there. There's like a detachment from the mob world, and it's constantly bringing people in throughout the series. But I think that there's something about like Artie as a character who deals with issues of being brought into that world and is affected by the toxicity of the decisions that Tony and his crew make. But there's something separate about him and that world, even though he is kind of pulled in. Just a thought.
Cool thought.
Thanks.
Where do you want to go next? I don't know.
Well, maybe Melfi's role in this episode I found kind of interesting. I mean, that's definitely like one of the big things that happens here is that she brings Tony back for therapy. So they've kind of been teasing at that for a number of episodes. Right. And then that kind of unfolds over the episode as well. And again, I'm just like always amazed at how efficient the writing can be. There's actually not that many scenes, not that much dialogue, but we're brought kind of through a journey that brings us there. And I think that sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that also relates to this aspect of like being a child. And I think that that's something that's really central for Melfi as a character. And that's something that she's kind of working out and has worked out with Kupferberg during her sessions. That's kind of a realization. I don't know if
she has worked it out with Kupferberg.
It's something that she's identified as like a primary psychological driver for her in terms of the way she acts. Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting that, she turns to Kupferberg at one point and, she calls him, she's like, you smug cocksucker, fuck you, walks out. All of a sudden, that's Tony action. Like, she's almost like turned into a Tony.
Well, and it's childish.
It's completely childish. But it's also like, I don't interpret her as a character as typically being like that. Like, I think she's been drawn in.
Well, just like Tony is acting out in all these weird ways. Well, not so weird for him, but Tony's acting out in these violent and angry ways, and he's like he tries to talk to Hesh about it, which are hilarious scenes. Yeah. She's also acting out, right? There's something about the draw between these two characters. They kind of rely on each other in some way, or they feed off of each other, maybe if you want to look at it more negatively. But there is something kind of inevitable about that because they both are kind of unable to function properly without each other.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
And there's something, too, I think that Kupferberg, even though sometimes he comes across as a bit of a joke of a psychoanalyst, there's something about that environment where now Melfi is forced to reckon with, deal with, reflect on, and think about all of these things that are going on. And I think that's challenging. And that,
yeah, well, she takes him seriously, even though he's a doofus. Like, she, like, actually does...
not to cast any aspersion.
Yeah. She actually does, like, consider his questions that he asks, even though they're stupid. Like, who in The Wizard of Oz would Tony be?
Right. Who would he be? The wizard?
I guess Oz himself, but...
Well, that's actually interesting that she says the wizard, because, I mean, my Wizard of Oz trivia is a little bit lacking, but the wizard's actually not a powerful character, right?
No, he's just a man behind a curtain.
He's just a man behind a curtain. Yeah. So maybe, actually, that's interesting, too, that Melfi's trying to get there, to kind of get behind the curtain with him.
Sure.
But there's something, too, where, like, she starts to regress to childlike behavior or emulate Tony's reactions to these kinds of issues, where I think she's also uncomfortable in that domain of ambiguity. So when she's there and she's dealing with, well, why do you feel this way? And maybe realizing and coming to the ultimate realization that treating Tony is actually a toxic thing. I think it's interesting because there's a few things. Like, first of all, even just like that environment, the art on the walls, which is something that we've talked about and looked at quite a bit, it's very abstract. Like, there's nothing to be made of it. Like, that environment is not clear cut.
Yeah.
And I think that's scary for people.
Yeah.
And I think that she's trying to come to grips with it, but is regressing and kind of taking the easy route. In fact, even when she says, and here I go again, but just got to do it, she says, I'm thinking of taking Tony back, and there's a shot on her, and all we see is her wearing black. She's wearing actually like a two-tone thing. It's like a black blazer over white. Yeah. But it's interesting because even like that two-tone outfit is actually like what the mobsters tend to wear.
Yeah.
It's like a combination of blacks and whites.
Yeah.
And there's something I think like simplistic, like it's actually regressing away from dealing with the complexities of these situations, and is clear cut, and she's angry, she leaves, she's going to take him back. But I think there's actually a lot more.
No, I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, it's what David Chase is always dealing with, right? Like, in order to decide to keep treating Tony or not, she kind of has to she has to make a definitive decision, right?
Yes.
There's not like, she can't like kind of treat Tony again, right? Like, she has to come to this very black and white understanding of what her role is in Tony's life and how she's going to deal with that. So, yeah.
I also thought it was interesting, like, the use of close-ups in this show is really an indicator of something important.
Tim Van Patten is excellent at that. Yeah. Like, he does, like, that's kind of part of his style, I think, too.
I think so. But it always indicates, like, an important exchange. So you have it with, like, Hesh and Tony, when Hesh says that his dad had panic attacks, and then, like, there's Tony's reaction is, like, very key. Because that's very important for him. Like, for him, that's, like, explaining why this is happening. Even though
it's like a black and white answer to his problem.
Yeah, the reality is there's probably not that much closure. But there's also some really interesting close-ups between Melfi and Kupferberg, where Kupferberg says, like, what are you not telling me?
Right.
And she says, I don't know. And you're kind of going between them. And I think it's really...
You see her kind of swallow.
Yeah, I feel like that scene, that part of the therapy session is actually getting the closest to the core of it. And there's like this lack of acknowledgement of the sexual energy between them. And she definitively says no. But there is something there that's being unspoken. And you have to kind of wonder what it is. And what I also found interesting is that it ends up, that line of query ends up with, he can be such a little boy sometimes. And then there's this quick edit to him in the car with Furio.
Yeah. Talking about going in to the whorehouse.
And so maybe it's complicated. Like, that's not really acting like a little boy. Like, he's like a destructive, dangerous man.
Sociopath,
yeah. But at the same time, that behavior, there is something about it just in terms of like what he engages in. It's very simplistic. So it's complicated. But I also thought it was interesting because he can be such a little boy sometimes. I don't think that that's the correct line of deduction. Like, I think there's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
I think that that's like a dangerous oversimplification. And I think that's maybe part of it too, like in that psychoanalysis milieu or whatever, there's this danger of over analyzing and maybe like coming up with closure and answers for things that don't necessarily warrant it, that are too multifactorial to have like a clear cut answer.
Yeah.
Kind of like maybe what we're doing, but it's something to be aware of.
Totally. I also like how she says seeing him will be therapeutic for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Cooper Bear like kind of calls her out on that, but that's like a pretty dangerous like.
He does call her out. He says this is supposed to be therapeutic. Like this is your therapy.
Yeah. Which is but. Yeah, I don't know what it is that draws her. I mean, I can hypothesize what it is that draws her back into that, but in some ways it's problematic. I mean, like I don't know what her intentions really are.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you have to ask when you're going into psychoanalysis. It's interesting that she asked Tony when he finally comes back at the end of the episode, and he says to direct my power and anger against those that deserve it.
I wrote that down too. Yeah.
Which is interesting because there's actually like an irony in his intention, because clearly he deserves it because his actions are making him feel this way. It's not as simple as his dad has panic attacks, so he has panic attacks. It's not something that's necessarily hereditary. I feel like he's not owning up the things that he does in the world, and that it's kind of building up underneath the surface to have an impact on him. So anyway, I found an irony in that. But that's also, in terms of analysis, a very like damaging and kind of violent goal to have.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about their goals. They're all flawed.
He also wants to be in total control, which is a very like black and white thing to want, right? And really and she says that's impossible.
Yeah. It was interesting too when when Tony tells her what he was doing with Furio, and she says, did you want to be the one giving the beating or taking it? Which, if for nothing else, I thought was interesting just in reestablishing the power dynamic. Yeah. By looking at the way that Tony responds to that.
Well, because he gets his kicks out of he was getting turned on by telling her what he was really doing, right? You see his smug face, and he's looking for that reaction, and she does not give that to him.
No.
She turns it back on him. So
yeah, and I feel like that power dynamic just doesn't exist otherwise. There's nobody who's questioning him at that level, or is above him in that way. Yeah, where he's going to be examined and thought about. Yeah, it was interesting too. We've talked about Cigar as a symbol of being in control. So when he's there waiting for Furio, he's smoking a cigar. And he's kind of in his element. And then he gets the call from Melfi. As soon as he gets the call, he takes the cigar out of his mouth and he doesn't smoke it again. So there's
he does when Furio gets back in the car.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
But anyway, it's interesting because there is a loss of control when he enters into that domain.
What about her kind of getting wasted before she calls him?
Right.
And reaching for that glass of wine during the call?
Yeah,
and she was acting kind of like a giggly schoolgirl also for a lot of this, kind of like she was acting when she said "toodle fucking new" or whoever last episode.
Yeah, so maybe she's not confronting her issues, even though she has figured them out and has the benefit of, training and expertise in this world.
Those who can't do teach, maybe.
That's a nice thing for somebody in education to say.
Yeah. What else? Well, I kind of want to contrast the Melfi scenes, I guess, with the scenes where Tony goes to Hesh, kind of for therapy, right? Yeah. We have two scenes. The first one where he just kind of shows up at Hesh's place, and that's when he finds out about his dad having panic attacks, But they have this this great scene, right? He's talking about his anger, and then he's like, I had this fucking weird dream. And he's like, I was wearing a suit and shoes, and I was on the beach, right? Hesh is talking about God knows what.
I think getting a garden hose up your butt.
Yeah, well, he's talking about this article that was in the New York Times that Tony then references later on to Melfi. Without any context, but about how, these responses to fear show up on a brain scan, right? Yeah. It actually, shows up in your brain. Yeah. So I was going to think about that a little bit, too. But you have Hesh just talking about something completely different, and Tony's like, do you want to hear about this fucking dream or not? Right. And then we don't hear about it. The scene cuts from there. And it's kind of the same with Melfi, right? We have this dream being replayed from the episode before, right? We actually have a visual replay of it. And we have Melfi telling it again to Kupferberg, right? So they've been coming back to this dream as something very important. I don't know what Tony's dream was. We do see him have dreams on beaches and things like that later on.
Yeah.
And then we have another scene with him and Hesh later on where they're sitting in Hesh's fancy room. And again, like they're having these two separate conversations with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really just talking over each other. They're just kind of dictating their own stories.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because actually they're both exasperated by it.
Yeah.
Like they're both exasperated by the other. Hesh is there like he wants to sleep. He's putting in little comments. When Hesh starts talking, you see Tony. I think the last scene is him like kind of like slumping down.
Yeah.
The same way he did to Vin Makazian when he was telling him about his problems.
Yeah.
So neither of them are interested in the other or their issues.
Yeah.
They just like to talk.
Yeah.
Which also establishes how Tony does need to air these grievances and issues with somebody, and that Hesh is the closest thing he has, but clearly like that's not an appropriate realm for it. It's just like not working.
No. We have a little bit with Pussy.
Mm-hmm.
So we see him a couple times behaving suspiciously. So of course he's been kind of like not given this promotion that Polly's been given, right? So we have, you know, Tony telling this to Polly. He's saying, you know, he makes that joke about Polly leaving an empty box of Malamars or something like that. And anyways, and so Polly kind of gets this promotion. Furio is put into this system on the same level as Pussy, right? So like they both report to Polly and Phil. And then we have a scene later on where they're at Vesuvio's again, Polly and Pussy, and then Furio comes to sit down with them. And then Johnny Sack comes in, and Polly asks Pussy to leave, but not Furio.
Right.
Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why, like, why they would have let Furio stay there for that conversation.
It is interesting.
But then we have, like, at the party, like, Furio's welcome party, I guess it is. Like, we have Pussy trying to get some information out of Silvio, and he's like, we'll talk later.
Yeah.
And then we have this scene with him and Skip.
Yeah.
The FBI agent. And they're both kind of complaining about poor them. They've been passed over by these younger guys or these new guys. They're both kind of like confiding in each other, connecting to each other.
Well, that was an interesting scene too, because they're commiserating over like a milkshake. Yeah. Which directly contrasts the scene of that you were just talking about at Vesuvio, like around Italian food. They're now in this like American environment. So I feel like it's like Pussy's kind of like movement towards getting outside of the mob and being affiliated with Skip over his mob family is kind of like taking a step there. Like he's in this new environment that's actually like foreign from the Italian world. Yeah. And it's actually unusual to see those characters, you know, kind of like in a place like that. I mean, there are scenes in diners and mobs and stuff, but I feel like it's like connecting Pussy to Skip in a way. Like they're bonding over food, which is something that happens a lot in this show. Yeah. And it's not Italian.
No. We also have Pussy not standing up to greet Johnny Sack, which is weird. I don't know.
Yeah. Like, and he said he wasn't going to anyway. But we have to be questioning why, and if it's whether or not he's wearing a wire or... Yeah.
Just the only other scene of people eating. Well, actually, we get a couple, and I know you want to talk about one of them because you said it while we were watching. But we have a couple scenes of food.
Is there some colorful food?
There's some food. I'll talk about mine first. One of our first scenes, right after we have like Christopher's first scene with the acting class and stuff like that, after they go to the tanning salon. We have Tony sitting on the couch dipping meat into mayonnaise.
I missed that.
Yeah, no, that was like gross. Like into a like Hellman's mayonnaise
Sounds pretty
jar. Good. It was disgusting. That's when he's seeing this stuff on the news about himself.
Right, yelling.
And he's yelling to nobody. But you had some food. There was a lot of orange juice.
There was a lot of oranges, yeah.
And then, of course, in Christopher's acting scene, there's a guy carrying a bag of oranges.
That's right. Well, that was really interesting.
Invisible orange.
Omar carrying his bag of oranges. But that's funny when Chris says, you know, you're dropping your fucking oranges. Yeah. And it's for me, that was also indicative of like his aptitude as an actor to notice something small like that. Like you said with the zipper, like he is able to put himself in that role. Yeah, there was a lot of oranges, from that scene. There's Tony drinking orange juice near the beginning, shortly before he goes over to Janice's house, where Richie's sitting there with orange juice, or not sitting, but he's with orange juice
on the counter,
and he's making eggs, which I think I talked about recently. I talked about that for the first time, like this show starting to introduce eggs as like their godfather's oranges.
Right.
So to see, for me, if nothing else, to see Richie with orange juice behind him making eggs, coming from a scene with orange juice on the counter, there's just something very foreboding about that.
Yeah.
There's just something that's a little bit off and actually a little bit menacing, because they do tend to relate eggs and oranges with death. So you have to kind of question, like, if that relationship between Tony and Richie, which is clearly already strained, is going to reach a breaking point.
Or maybe Janice and Richie are going to be so happy and live happily ever after.
Yeah. Just, buy an orange farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
things are going to go super well. That's, I think, what it's telling me.
Yeah, I think so. That's typically what happens in this show. That's always a very safe guess.
Yeah, totally.
I have some stray observations. What do you have? What do you think?
Yeah, just some stray stuff.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, Tony imposing the idea of the mozzarella maker on Artie when he's there. Like,
right.
Again, just like the dominance and the lack of regard for Artie and his expertise to just kind of like come in and tell him what to do. We've talked in earlier episodes about people getting involved in things that they really know nothing about, but kind of having confidence in it. And for Tony to kind of just come in and tell Artie, how he should be running his business is interesting, especially in, regards to not paying his bill. So there's like a very kind of like damaging relationship. Like the power structure is so weird, and Artie isn't really capable of responding to it either. Like he has to kind of just like go along with all of these things. So you can kind of see like the dominance of Tony where he stands, even though like in the mob family there's like a very concrete hierarchy and we know where he stands. Even outside, his dominance still exists.
I wanted to talk about Mitch the Porsche salesman.
Mitch the Porsche salesman. What a great character.
He's great. I wish he would come back.
I hope he does.
What a hilarious character. And the way that Tim Van Patten like uses those kind of like close-ups on him is really funny.
Right.
Like when he like does he like looks down and then looks up to start his scenes, like very dramatically. When he's talking about, his like, he's written a couple scripts but nothing's been bought yet. He's
right.
Just like the epitome of like American TV. I just feel like, or like, I don't know, like this like kind of empty, materialistic, I don't know. He's great.
Right.
He's really great.
I just thought he was kind of a dweeb.
No, he's like, he is. He's a total dweeb. But in that scene where they have to say like A and B to each other or whatever. Right. I like all those characters in the acting class, actually.
They're great.
They're all great. Omar is a great character.
That's it. It's over.
That's it. It's over. But when they have to do this A and B thing, like, I don't know what it is that Chris interpreted from the way he said. He does this kind of like dramatic look up and says A. Or whatever.
Yeah.
I also like in just again, it's more of a stray observation about Christopher in this acting class. Like, I love how Adriana kind of like in terms of this like therapy relationship, Adriana was spot on with talking about how like maybe this is something that you're grappling with, like with your father and him dying young, and like, so she really hits the nail on the head pretty well. And
then Chris turns it around and does what we've seen Tony do, where he flips it in an aggressive way against her. He says, "Whoa, did you learn that taking people's orders at the restaurant?"
Yeah.
So it's this like diversion tactic of using cruelty.
Yeah.
To escape actually dealing with things. I thought it was interesting, like when they really like establish how out of place Christopher is throughout the whole acting class. When he walks in late and he comes in with like one sheet of paper, and everybody has like books and is ready and is sitting there listening, doesn't have a pencil or pen and has to ask for it. Like, I mean, some of them are obvious, like, you can just tell when you're watching that he's asking for the pencil because it's like written in. But yeah, just the things like he's so ill-equipped to deal with that.
Yeah.
Well-
But everyone there kind of likes him.
Yeah,
Until,
well,
until he punches Mitch in the face.
He's
and,
talented, yeah.
Yeah, and they're like supportive of him.
I
And
think they just think he's kind of like this crazy wild card because when he just like storms out
Yeah.
too, you see people kind of like exasperated.
yeah.
Like there he goes again.
I thought you were going to comment on the whorehouse that on the front of it, it says the hottest tan in town.
I wasn't.
People making themselves darker.
No, I had nothing to say about that. Do you have something to say about that?
I don't. The color tan.
No, that's not it. That's not it.
It's between black and white.
I would like to comment though on the boat names.
Okay.
Well, so Stugatz, which is this kind of like crass Italian term, I thought it was interesting. So when he goes over and like grabs the Russian dude's testicles and comes back and he's walking by and the people are watching, the boat that they're on, that the family is watching from, is called Thank God. And I thought it was interesting that like Thank God is parked right next to Stugatz.
Right.
And they're watching like...
What's the name of the Russian boat?
Okay, so here's the problem. I wrote down a name of another boat and I found it interesting, but my writing's really bad. It's something like...
Where is it?
Bang, bong...
Oh.
Uh-oh. It was something like her or something, but it wasn't. It was like that. Anyway, so my comments are lacking on that one because I don't know what the first word is. But I can comment on Thank God. It's impossible. You'll never figure it out. My writing is indecipherable. But that's okay. But thank God. I mean, there is just like such like a clash. There's such like a juxtaposition between like Tony and the people around him.
Yeah, too bad you don't have the third one.
Yeah, it's an amazing point, and it's pretty much the key to the entire show.
I think so.
I'm sure everything would just make a lot more sense. So
Probably.
maybe watch it again. You can let us know what the third boat is called.
Yeah.
Buck her. Something like that.
Okay.
Well, thanks for listening.
That's it.
Let us know what the boat's name is.
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts about what tan means, that's great too.
I mean,
What doesn't?
lots.
Lots. Okay. Well, see you next time.
Okay, bye.